Veteran denied. Access to restaurant. He returns the next day with his lawyer. The warm glow of street lamps flickered to life as dusk settled over the quaint town of Millbrook. Nestled in the heart of this affluent community, Seasons Bistro stood as a beacon of culinary excellence and social status. Its large bay windows offered passers-by tantalizing glimpses of crystal chandeliers and meticulously set tables draped in crisp white linens. On this particular Friday evening, the restaurant hummed with the animated chatter of its well-heeled patrons, their laughter mingling with the soft clink of fine china and silverware. Amidst this scene of casual opulence, a weathered pickup truck rumbled to a stop across the street. From it emerged James Hartley, a man whose appearance stood in stark contrast to the bistro's polished ambiance. At 48, James bore the quiet dignity of a man who had seen more of life than most. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and though his clothes were simple, a clean flannel shirt tucked into well-worn jeans, they were pressed with care. The calluses on his hands spoke of years of hard work, both in service to his country and, more recently, at the local construction site, where he now earned his living. As James crossed the street, his steps were measured and purposeful. He'd been looking forward to this moment all week, a rare treat to himself after a grueling stretch of overtime. The tantalizing aromas wafting from the bistro's kitchen reminded him of how long it had been since he'd enjoyed a meal that wasn't hastily microwaved or grabbed from a food truck. Pushing open the heavy oak door, James was enveloped by the warm air inside, scented with garlic and herbs. He paused for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the soft lighting. The maitre d's podium stood before him, a gleaming barrier between the outside world and the exclusive inner sanctum of Seasons Bistro. Behind the podium stood Amanda Prescott, the hostess on duty. At 25, Amanda was the picture of poise and sophistication. Her blonde hair swept up into an immaculate chignon, her black dress a perfect complement to the restaurant's understated elegance. As James approached, Amanda's welcoming smile faltered almost imperceptibly. Her gaze flicked over his attire, and in that split second, judgments were made. "Good evening, sir," Amanda greeted, her tone polite but cooler than the one she'd used for the couple who'd entered moments before. "Do you have a reservation?" James shook his head, offering a friendly smile. "No, ma'am. I was hoping you might have a table for one available. I don't mind waiting if needed." Amanda's perfectly manicured fingers tapped at the tablet before her, though her eyes never really left James. "I'm afraid we're fully booked this evening," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she added, "And we do have a dress code." James glanced around, noting several empty tables and patrons in attire not dissimilar to his own. Confusion furrowed his brow. "I see some open tables there," he pointed out gently, "and I'm happy to wait for one to become available. As for the dress code, I assure you these are my best clothes. I made sure to press them specially for tonight." Amanda's lips pressed into a thin line, her discomfort evident. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but sharp. "Sir, I don't think you understand. This isn't the kind of place for people like you. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street." The words hit James like a physical blow. He felt heat rising in his cheeks, a mixture of shame and anger coursing through him. In that moment, he was no longer James Hartley, the decorated veteran who had led men into battle and made split-second decisions that saved lives. He was reduced to nothing more than his appearance, deemed unworthy based on a cursory glance. James opened his mouth to protest, to explain that he was a paying customer like any other, but the words died on his lips as he noticed the stares from nearby patrons. Their curious glances quickly turned judgmental, as if Amanda's dismissal had confirmed their own initial impressions. For a brief moment, James considered standing his ground, demanding to speak to a manager. But as the weight of the stares pressed down on him, he felt a weariness settle into his bones. This was supposed to be a night of relaxation, a reward for his hard work. Instead, it had become yet another battle, one he hadn't been prepared to fight. With a quiet nod, James turned and walked out of the restaurant, the sound of resumed conversations and clinking glasses following him like mocking laughter. As the cool night air hit his face, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions within him. Standing on the sidewalk, James looked back at the warm glow of the restaurant windows. Through the glass, he could see life continuing as if nothing had happened. Diners laughed and clinked glasses. Waiters glided between tables with practiced ease. And at the podium, Amanda was already greeting the next guests with a bright smile. The injustice of it all settled like a lead weight in James's stomach. He had fought for the freedoms these people enjoyed, had watched friends die defending the ideals of equality and justice. And yet, here he stood, excluded and humiliated based on nothing more than his appearance. As he walked back to his truck, James's initial shame began to crystallize into something harder, more resolute. This wasn't just about him, he realized. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every individual deemed unworthy based on superficial judgments. Sitting in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, James made a decision. He wouldn't let this stand. Not for himself, and not for anyone else who might face similar treatment in the future. With newfound determination, he started the engine, his mind already formulating a plan. As he drove away from Seasons Bistro, the taillights of his truck fading into the night, James knew that this was far from over. He would return, but not as a solitary diner seeking a quiet meal. No, when he came back, it would be to challenge the very notions that had led to his humiliation. The battle lines had been drawn, and James Hartley, veteran and citizen, was ready to fight once more, this time, for the dignity and respect that every person deserves. The gentle hum of the refrigerator provided a backdrop to James's restless thoughts as he sat at his kitchen table later that evening. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the passage of time since his humiliating experience at Seasons Bistro. His dinner, a hastily microwaved frozen meal, sat half-eaten before him. A far cry from the culinary experience he had anticipated earlier, James's calloused fingers drummed an erratic rhythm on the worn wooden tabletop, his mind replaying the events of the evening. The condescending tone of the hostess, the judgmental stares of the other patrons, the feeling of utter displacement, it all swirled in his thoughts, stoking a fire of indignation that refused to be extinguished. He had faced adversity before, both on the battlefield and in civilian life, but this felt different. This wasn't about overcoming physical obstacles or navigating bureaucratic red tape. This was about challenging a system that allowed people to be categorized and dismissed based on appearance alone. As the clock struck 9, James's gaze fell on a framed photograph on the wall. It was a group shot from his military days, showing him and his fellow soldiers standing proud in their uniforms. Among the faces was Sarah Donovan, a woman whose intelligence and determination had always impressed James. They had served together, facing life and death situations that forged a bond stronger than mere friendship. After their service, Sarah had pursued a career in law, specializing in civil rights cases. She had made a name for herself defending veterans and other marginalized groups, fighting against the very kind of discrimination James had faced tonight. With a sudden clarity of purpose, James reached for his phone. His fingers hesitated for a moment over Sarah's contact information. It had been a while since they'd spoken, and he wondered briefly if he should be bothering her with this. But the memory of Amanda's dismissive words steeled his resolve. He pressed the call button. The phone rang several times, and James found himself holding his breath. Just as he was about to give up, a familiar voice answered. "James, is that you?" Sarah's tone was a mixture of surprise and concern. It wasn't like James to call this late. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you at this hour," James began, his voice steady despite the emotions churning within him. I need your help." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice had taken on the focused tone James remembered from their military days. "What's going on, James?" As James recounted the events at Seasons Bistro, Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification but mostly allowing him to tell his story uninterrupted. With each word, James felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Here was someone who understood, someone who could see beyond the surface to the heart of the matter. When James finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Sarah's voice came through, filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "James, what happened to you tonight wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. Businesses can't discriminate against customers based on their appearance or perceived social status. This is exactly the kind of case I've dedicated my career to fighting." James felt a surge of relief wash over him. He had known Sarah would understand, but hearing her professional assessment of the situation validated his feelings in a way he hadn't realized he needed. "So, what do we do?" James asked, his earlier weariness giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah's response was immediate and decisive. "We fight back. Not just for you, James, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel less than because of how they look or where they come from. This is about sending a message that such behavior won't be tolerated." As Sarah outlined a preliminary plan of action, James felt his spirits lift. They agreed to meet the following day to discuss the details and prepare their approach. Before ending the call, Sarah's tone softened slightly. "I'm proud of you for reaching out, James. It takes courage to stand up against injustice, especially when you're the one who's been wronged." After hanging up, James was struck by how much and how little had changed. They had fought for their country then, and now they were preparing to fight for the values that country was supposed to uphold. As he prepared for bed that night, James felt a sense of anticipation building within him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he would face them with an ally by his side and justice as his goal. The battle ahead was not one of weapons and tactics, but of principles and human dignity, and James Hartley, veteran and citizen, was ready to stand on the front lines once more. The following afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quaint streets of Millbrook. James Hartley stood on the sidewalk opposite Seasons Bistro, his posture straight and resolute. He wore the same modest attire as the previous evening, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes about his intention to challenge the restaurant's discriminatory practices. Beside him stood Sarah Donovan, a stark contrast in her sharp, charcoal gray suit and crisp white blouse. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her green eyes sparkled with a mix of determination and barely contained indignation. In her hand, she clutched a sleek leather briefcase, its contents an arsenal of legal documents that would serve as their weapons in the battle ahead. "Are you ready for this, James?" Sarah asked, her voice low and steady. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture that transported them both back to their days in uniform, preparing for missions where the stakes were often life and death. James took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the restaurant's entrance. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Let's do this." Together, they crossed the street, their steps synchronized as if they were once again on patrol. As they approached the entrance, James couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt compared to the previous night. The early evening crowd was just beginning to trickle in, the soft glow of the interior lights promising warmth and hospitality, a promise that, for James, had proven hollow. Pushing open the heavy oak door, they stepped into the foyer of Seasons Bistro. The familiar sense of garlic and herbs wafted through the air, but this time, her demeanor exuding quiet authority. "Good evening," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I'm Sarah Donovan, attorney at law, and this," she gestured to James, "is my client, James Hartley. We're here to address a serious matter concerning Mr. Hartley's treatment at this establishment yesterday evening." Amanda's face paled, her fingers gripping the edge of the podium. I'm not sure what you mean," she stammered, her eyes darting between James and Sarah. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding?" Sarah's expression remained impassive as she reached into her briefcase, extracting a manila folder. "I'm afraid there's no misunderstanding, Ms.?" She paused, looking pointedly at Amanda's name tag. "Prescott," Amanda supplied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ms. Prescott," Sarah continued. "Yesterday evening, my client was denied service at this restaurant based solely on his appearance. He was told, and I quote, that this isn't the kind of place for people like you. Such discrimination is a clear violation of civil rights laws." As Sarah spoke, her voice carried through the restaurant's foyer. Nearby patrons turned to look, their conversations dying down as they sensed the tension unfolding before them. A couple seated near the entrance exchanged uncomfortable glances, while a group of businessmen at the bar craned their necks to get a better view of the confrontation. Amanda's composure crumbled further. I didn't mean... That is, we have certain standards and... Sarah cut her off, her voice taking on an edge of steel. Standards that apparently don't include treating all patrons with basic human dignity and respect? Mr. Hartley is a decorated veteran who has served this country with honor for over 2 decades. The freedoms he fought to protect include the right to be treated equally in public accommodations, regardless of appearance or social status. The mention of James's veteran status sent a ripple through the growing crowd of onlookers. An older gentleman at a nearby table stood up, his face a mask of disbelief and shame. "Is this true?" he asked, addressing James directly. "You served our country and were turned away from this place?" James nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir. 22 years in the Army. I just wanted to enjoy a nice meal after a long week of work." The older man shook his head in disgust. "This is unacceptable," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've been coming to this restaurant for years, but if this is how they treat our veterans, how they treat anyone, I won't be returning." His words seemed to break a dam of silence. Suddenly, other patrons began to voice their opinions, most expressing shock and disappointment at the restaurant's actions. The comfortable bubble of exclusivity that Seasons Bistro had cultivated was rapidly deflating, replaced by an atmosphere of tension and moral indignation. Amidst the growing commotion, the restaurant's manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged from the dining room. His face was a mask of concern as he took in the scene before him. The flustered hostess, the stern-faced lawyer, the veteran standing tall, and the agitated patrons. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mr. Thompson asked, attempting to project an air of calm authority. His eyes darted between Amanda, who looked on the verge of tears, and Sarah, whose steely gaze never wavered. Sarah turned to face the manager, her posture straightening imperceptibly. "Mr. Thompson, I presume. I'm Sarah Donovan, representing Mr. James Hartley." She gestured to James, who stood silently beside her, his presence a stark reminder of the injustice that had occurred. "We're here to address a serious incident of discrimination that took place in your establishment yesterday evening." Mr. Thompson's polished demeanor faltered for a moment as he processed Sarah's words. He quickly attempted to regain control of the situation, plastering on a placating smile. "I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding," he said, his voice smooth as he extended a hand toward James. "And we value all our customers here at Seasons Bistro." James didn't move to accept the handshake, his arms remaining firmly at his sides. The manager's outstretched hand hung awkwardly in the air for a moment before he slowly lowered it. Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm afraid there was no misunderstanding, Mr. Thompson. Yesterday, my client was explicitly told that this wasn't the kind of place for people like him. I'm sure you understand the implications of that statement and how it reflects on your establishment." The murmurs among the patrons grew louder. Some expressed shock, while others glanced uncomfortably at the staff, as if suddenly questioning every interaction they'd had in the restaurant. Mr. Thompson, growing visibly flustered, attempted to downplay the incident. "Well, let's not blow this out of proportion. We certainly didn't mean to offend anyone." He gestured toward an empty table near the window. "Please, allow me to seat you now. Perhaps we can discuss this matter over dinner, on the house, of course." But Sarah wasn't finished. She took another step forward, her voice projecting clearly through the now silent restaurant. "Mr. Thompson, this isn't about a free meal or a simple misunderstanding. This is about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, including the other patrons in her address. "The man standing before you is not just another customer. He's a veteran who served his country honorably for over 2 decades. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. James stood a little straighter, his chin lifted slightly as Sarah continued. "This man put his life on the line to protect the very freedoms that allow businesses like yours to thrive. He faced dangers most of us can't even imagine, all in service of his country and its people." Sarah's voice grew more impassioned with each word. And yet, when he came here last night, hoping to enjoy a meal after a long week of honest work, he was treated with disrespect and denied service. All because of how he looked. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted dramatically. The once judgmental patrons now looked at James with a mix of surprise, shame, and newfound respect. They had made assumptions, just like the restaurant staff. But now they realized they were in the presence of someone who had sacrificed more than they ever could. An older couple at a nearby table stood up, the woman wiping a tear from her eye. "We had no idea," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for your service, sir." Others joined in, offering words of support and gratitude to James. The mood had transformed from one of exclusivity and judgment to one of humility and recognition. Mr. Thompson, visibly shaken, tried to speak, but found himself at a loss for words. The gravity of the situation had finally sunk in, and he knew that this wasn't something that could be brushed aside with a free meal or a simple apology. As the manager struggled to find his voice, Amanda stepped forward, her earlier hostility replaced by genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry," she said, looking directly at James. "I made a terrible judgment, and I was wrong. So very wrong." James nodded acknowledgement of her apology, but his eyes remained fixed on Mr. Thompson. The manager knew that the next words out of his mouth would define not just this moment, but the future of his restaurant and perhaps his own career. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, his mind racing to find a way to salvage the situation. Years of experience in the hospitality industry had taught him how to handle difficult customers and smooth over minor conflicts. But this was unlike anything he had ever faced. The weight of dozens of eyes bore down on him, waiting to see how he would respond to this very public confrontation. "Mr. Hartley, Ms. Donovan," he began, his voice strained as he attempted to maintain his professional composure. "I want to assure you that Seasons Bistro has always prided itself on providing exemplary service to all our guests. What happened yesterday was unfortunate, but I'm certain it was an isolated incident." Sarah's eyebrow arched skeptically at his choice of words. "Unfortunate is spilling a glass of wine, Mr. Thompson. What happened to my client was discriminatory and illegal." Mr. Thompson winced internally at her sharp rebuttal, but pressed on. "Perhaps unfortunate was a poor choice of words. What I mean to say is that this is not reflective of our establishment's values or policies. We welcome people from all walks of life here at Seasons Bistro." As he spoke, Mr. Thompson gestured expansively around the dining room, as if the diverse crowd of wealthy patrons somehow proved his point. However, a quick glance around revealed that while there was some variation in age, the clientele was remarkably homogeneous in terms of apparent social class and background. James, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of his experiences. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, if that were true, I wouldn't be standing here right now. Your hostess made it very clear that I wasn't welcome based solely on my appearance." A murmur of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Mr. Thompson felt the situation slipping further out of his control. He turned to Amanda, who stood nearby, her face a mixture of shame and anxiety. "Amanda is relatively new to our team," Mr. Thompson explained, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm sure she simply misunderstood our policies. We'll make sure she receives additional training to prevent any such misunderstandings in the future." But his attempt to shift blame onto the young hostess backfired. Several patrons shook their heads in disapproval, seeing through the transparent attempt to scapegoat an employee rather than address the underlying issue. Sarah stepped forward again, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Thompson, deflecting responsibility onto your staff is not going to resolve this situation. The issue here is not just about one employee's actions, but about the culture and policies of this establishment as a whole." She pulled out a document from her briefcase and held it up for all to see. "This is a formal complaint detailing the civil rights violations that occurred here yesterday. It outlines the legal obligations of public accommodations under federal and state law, as well as the consequences for failing to meet those obligations." Mr. Thompson's face paled as he stared at the document, The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just about appeasing an unhappy customer or smoothing over a public relations hiccup. There could be serious legal and financial repercussions for the restaurant. "Now, wait just a moment," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Surely we can resolve this without resorting to legal action. What happened was clearly a mistake, and we're more than willing to make it right." But James shook his head slowly. "Mr. Thompson, this isn't about me getting a free meal or an apology. It's about making sure that no one else has to experience what I did. It's about holding establishments like yours accountable and ensuring that we welcome everyone isn't just an empty phrase, but a lived reality." A round of applause broke out among the patrons, many of whom were now standing in solidarity with James. The atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed completely. What had started as a confrontation had become a moment of community reckoning. Mr. Thompson looked around desperately, realizing that he was losing not just this battle, but potentially the support of his regular clientele. The carefully cultivated image of Seasons Bistro as an exclusive, high-end establishment was crumbling before his eyes, replaced by a growing perception of it as a bastion of outdated elitism and discrimination. As the applause died down, Sarah spoke again, her tone businesslike, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Mr. Thompson, we're not here to shut down your restaurant or ruin your business. We're here to ensure that real, substantive changes are made. Changes that will benefit not just Mr. Hartley, but every person who walks through your doors in the future." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "We're prepared to work with you to develop and implement new policies, training programs, and accountability measures. But make no mistake, if you're not willing to take this seriously and make genuine changes, we are fully prepared to pursue all legal avenues available to us." The ball was now squarely in Mr. Thompson's court. The next words out of his mouth would determine not just the immediate outcome of this confrontation, but the future of Seasons Bistro and perhaps even the broader community's approach to inclusivity and equality. As Mr. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, a hush fell over the restaurant. Patrons, staff, and even passers-by who had been drawn in by the commotion waited with bated breath to hear what he would say. In this moment, it wasn't just the fate of one restaurant hanging in the balance, but the values and character of the entire community. The silence that had fallen over Seasons Bistro was thick with anticipation. Mr. Thompson stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. As he struggled to find the right words, James Hartley cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. "If I may," James began, his voice quiet but firm, "I'd like to share something with everyone here." Sarah gave him an encouraging nod, and James took a deep breath before continuing. His posture straightened, almost unconsciously falling into the stance of a soldier reporting to his commanding officer. 22 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, James said, his eyes sweeping across the room. "I served 4 tours of duty, 2 in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I've seen things that would haunt your nightmares, and I've done things that will stay with me for the rest of my life." The restaurant was utterly silent now, every person hanging on James's words. Even Mr. Thompson, who had been frantically trying to formulate a response, stood transfixed. "I've lost friends," James continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Good men and women who gave their lives for the ideals this country stands for: freedom, equality, justice. When I came home, I thought I was leaving the battlefield behind. But I've come to realize that the fight for those ideals doesn't end when you take off the uniform." He paused, looking directly at Mr. Thompson. "When I walked in here yesterday, I wasn't looking for special treatment. I didn't expect anyone to roll out a red carpet or thank me for my service. All I wanted was to be treated with the same respect as any other customer, to be judged by the content of my character, not the clothes on my back or the calluses on my hands." A few patrons nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. Amanda, the hostess, looked down at her hands, shame etched across her face. "You know, the funny thing is," James continued, a sad smile playing at his lips. When you're in a foxhole with bombs going off around you, you don't care what the guy next to you looks like or where he comes from. You only care that he has your back, just like you have his. Out there, we were all equal. We were all just soldiers, fighting for each other and for something bigger than ourselves. He gestured around the restaurant. I look around this room, and I see people from all walks of life. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, workers. Each of you has your own story, your own struggles and triumphs. But at our core, aren't we all deserving of the same basic respect and dignity? An older gentleman in the corner, his dinner forgotten, stood up. I served in Vietnam, he said, his voice wavering. What this man is saying, it's the truth. We fought for everyone's rights, not just those who can afford to eat at fancy restaurants. Another patron, a middle-aged woman in a business suit, spoke up. My son is serving right now, she said. The thought that he could come home and be treated this way, it's unacceptable. The mood in the restaurant had shifted dramatically. What had started as a confrontation had become a moment of collective reflection. People who had come for a simple meal found themselves grappling with complex issues of equality, respect, and the true meaning of service. Sarah, sensing the impact of James's words, stepped forward again. This is about more than just one incident or one restaurant, she said. It's about the kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be a place where people are judged by their appearance or by their character? Where veterans like Mr. Hartley are turned away, or where they're welcomed with open arms? Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent throughout James's speech, finally found his voice. Mr. Hartley, he began, his tone subdued. I don't know what to say. You're right. We've failed you. And in doing so, we failed to live up to the ideals that you and so many others have fought to protect. He turned to face the rest of the restaurant. I've always prided myself on running a first-class establishment, but I see now that true class isn't about expensive wines or fancy decor. It's about how we treat each other, all of us. Amanda stepped forward, tears in her eyes. Mr. Hartley, I'm so sorry, she said. I made a terrible judgment, and I was wrong. So very wrong. Your service and sacrifice, I can't even begin to comprehend it. I hope you can forgive me. James nodded, accepting her apology with grace. We all make mistakes, he said. What matters is how we learn from them and do better going forward. Mr. Thompson straightened his shoulders, a look of determination replacing his earlier uncertainty. Miss Donovan, he said, turning to Sarah, you mentioned working together to implement new policies and training. I want to do that, not just because of the legal implications, but because it's the right thing to do. He looked around the restaurant, meeting the eyes of his staff and patrons. Starting today, Seasons Bistro is going to change. We'll be a place that truly welcomes everyone, regardless of their appearance or background. We'll institute new training programs for our staff, revise our policies, and work to become a model of inclusivity for other businesses in the community. A round of applause broke out, growing in intensity as more people joined in. The atmosphere in the restaurant had transformed completely. What had begun as a confrontation had become a catalyst for change. As the applause died down, Mr. Thompson turned back to James and Sarah. Mr. Hartley, Miss Donovan, I hope you'll work with us as we make these changes. Your insights and experiences would be invaluable in helping us do better. Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. We'd be happy to assist in any way we can, Mr. Thompson. This is exactly the kind of positive response we were hoping for. James, who had stood stoically throughout much of the exchange, finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, he said. This is a good first step. I look forward to seeing the changes you implement. As the tension in the room dissipated, replaced by a sense of purpose and unity, it became clear that this evening had become about much more than one man's experience at a restaurant. It had become a moment of community reckoning, a chance for people to reflect on their own biases and the way they treated others. Patrons began to mingle, sharing their own stories and perspectives. The lines that had once divided them, lines of class, status, and appearance seemed to blur and fade. In their place, a new sense of connection and understanding began to emerge. As James and Sarah prepared to leave, several patrons approached them, offering handshakes, words of gratitude, and in some cases, tearful apologies for their own past judgments. The evening had become a powerful reminder of the impact one person's stand for justice could have on an entire community. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in Seasons Bistro continued to evolve. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a moment of collective introspection and commitment to change. Mr. Thompson, who had initially struggled to respond to the situation, now stood at the center of the dining room, addressing the assembled patrons and staff with a newfound sense of purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed restaurant, "I want to thank you all for your patience and understanding this evening. What we've witnessed here is not just a moment of reckoning for Seasons Bistro, but an opportunity for all of us to reflect on our values and actions." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on James and Sarah. "Mr. Hartley, Mrs. Donovan, I want to offer you both my deepest and most sincere apologies. The treatment you received yesterday, Mr. Hartley, was inexcusable. It goes against everything that I thought this establishment stood for, and it has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about the culture we've cultivated here." Amanda, the hostess who had initially turned James away, stepped forward. Her earlier defensiveness had given way to genuine remorse. I too, want to apologize," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My actions were thoughtless and hurtful. I made judgments based on appearance, and in doing so, I failed not just as an employee, but as a human being. Mr. Hartley, your service and sacrifice deserve so much more than the disrespect I showed you." James nodded, acknowledging their words with quiet dignity. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your willingness to acknowledge the mistake and commit to change means a great deal." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. "But apologies, while necessary, are not enough. Actions speak louder than words, and it's clear that we need to take concrete steps to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." He turned to address his staff, who had gathered near the kitchen entrance. "Starting tomorrow, we will be implementing a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures. We'll be bringing in experts to conduct sensitivity training for all of our staff, from the kitchen to the front of house. We'll also be revising our hiring practices to ensure we're building a team that reflects the diversity of our community." Several staff members nodded in agreement, some looking relieved that clear action was being taken to address the issue. Mr. Thompson continued. "Furthermore, we'll be establishing a community advisory board to help guide our efforts towards becoming a more inclusive establishment. Mr. Hartley, Miss Donovan, I'd like to invite both of you to be part of this board, if you're willing. Your perspectives would be invaluable as we work to transform Seasons Bistro into a truly welcoming space for all." Sarah exchanged a glance with James before responding. "We appreciate the offer, Mr. Thompson. While we can't make any commitments at this moment, we're certainly open to discussing how we might contribute to your efforts moving forward." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Many patrons nodded in satisfaction, seeing that real, tangible steps were being proposed to address the underlying issues. One of the regular customers, an older woman known for her philanthropic work in the community, stood up. "Mr. Thompson, if I may," she said, her voice carrying authority. "I think what you're proposing is admirable, but I believe we can do more. I'd like to propose that Seasons Bistro partners with local veterans, organizations, to offer special dining events and job opportunities for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. It's a small way we can show our appreciation for their service and ensure that what happened to Mr. Hartley never happens to another veteran in our community." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic applause. Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up at the idea. "That's an excellent suggestion, Mrs. Hawthorne. Consider it done. We'll start reaching out to local veterans groups first thing tomorrow." As the discussion continued, With more patrons offering suggestions and commitments to support the bistro's transformation, James leaned over to Sarah. "You know," he said quietly, when I called you yesterday, I never imagined it would lead to all this." Sarah smiled, a mix of pride and satisfaction in her eyes. Sometimes it takes one person standing up for what's right to catalyze real change. You did that, James. You turned a personal injustice into an opportunity for an entire community to grow. As the evening wound down, patrons began to leave, many stopping to shake James's hand or offer words of support. The mood was one of cautious optimism, a sense that while there was still much work to be done, a significant first step had been taken. Mr. Thompson approached James and Sarah one last time as they prepared to leave. "I know that a single evening can't undo the hurt you experienced, Mr. Hartley," he said solemnly. "But I want you to know that your courage in coming back here, in sharing your story, it's going to make a real difference. Not just for Seasons Bistro, but for our entire community." James nodded, extending his hand to Mr. Thompson. As they shook hands, there was a sense of a new understanding being forged. "That's all I ever wanted," James said. "Not special treatment, not revenge, just the knowledge that maybe, because of what happened here, someone else won't have to go through what I did." As James and Sarah stepped out into the cool evening air, they paused for a moment, looking back at the restaurant. Through the windows, they could see staff and remaining patrons engaged in animated discussion, the energy of change palpable even from outside. "So, counselor," James said with a slight smile, "what's our next move?" Sarah chuckled, her professional demeanor softening. "Well, we've certainly got our work cut out for us, but for tonight, I'd say we've earned ourselves a quiet dinner. What do you say we grab a bite at that diner you mentioned? I hear they serve everyone there. No questions asked." As they walked away from Seasons Bistro, there was a sense that while one chapter had closed, another was just beginning. The events of the evening had set in motion changes that would ripple out far beyond the walls of a single restaurant, touching lives across the community and perhaps even beyond. In the days and weeks to come, there would be challenges to face and hard work to be done. But for now, as James and Sarah made their way down the quiet street, there was a feeling of accomplishment, of having stood up for what was right and seeing the beginnings of real change take root. The story of James Hartley and Seasons Bistro would be told and retold, becoming a touchstone for discussions about equality, respect, and the ongoing fight for civil rights. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for change is the courage of one individual willing to stand up and say, "This is not right." As they disappeared around the corner, the lights of Seasons Bistro glowed warmly behind them, no longer a symbol of exclusivity, but a beacon of hope for a more inclusive and understanding community. In the weeks and months that followed the confrontation at Seasons Bistro, the ripple effects of that pivotal evening spread far beyond the restaurant's walls. The story of James Hartley, the veteran who stood up against discrimination, became a catalyst for change throughout Millbrook and beyond. Local news outlets were quick to pick up the story. The Millbrook Gazette ran a front-page article titled, "A Taste of Equality: How One Veteran's Stand Transformed a Community." The piece detailed James's experience and the subsequent events at Seasons Bistro, painting a vivid picture of a community grappling with its values and prejudices. As promised, Mr. Thompson wasted no time in implementing changes at Seasons Bistro. The restaurant closed for a week to undergo a comprehensive staff training program focused on inclusivity and unconscious bias. When it reopened, patrons were greeted with a new sign in the window that read, "All are welcome here, no exceptions." Amanda, the hostess who had initially turned James away, became an unexpected champion for change. Deeply affected by her role in the incident and inspired by James's forgiveness, she threw herself into learning about diversity and inclusion. Her genuine transformation and willingness to speak openly about her past mistakes made her a powerful advocate for the restaurant's new ethos. The Community Advisory Board, as suggested during that eventful night, was established with a diverse group of members. James Hartley and Sarah Donovan both accepted positions, along with local business leaders, civil rights activists, and community organizers. Their first meeting was covered by the local press, symbolizing a new era of transparency and community engagement for Seasons Bistro. True to their word, the restaurant partnered with local veterans organizations to host monthly service and civilian dinners. These events brought together veterans and civilians for meals and conversations, breaking down barriers and fostering understanding. The initiative was so successful that other restaurants in town began to adopt similar programs. However, the path to change wasn't without its challenges. Some of Seasons Bistro's longtime patrons, uncomfortable with the new, more inclusive atmosphere, took their business elsewhere. For a few months, the restaurant's profits dipped, leading to whispers around town that the changes might bankrupt the establishment. But Mr. Thompson remained steadfast in his commitment. "We're not just running a business," he told the Millbrook Gazette in a follow-up interview. "We're building a community. If that means losing some customers who don't share our values, so be it. We'll gain 10 more who do." His words proved prophetic. As word spread about Seasons Bistro's transformation, new customers began to flock to the restaurant. People who had never felt welcome before now made it their regular haunt. Families celebrated milestones there. Community groups held meetings in its private dining room, and a diverse array of patrons filled its tables night after night. 6 months after the incident, Seasons Bistro was honored with the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce's Business of the Year award, specifically citing its commitment to inclusivity and community engagement. The ceremony, held in the restaurant itself, was a far cry from the exclusive establishment it had once been. Veterans in uniform mingled with business executives in suits, while families with young children and elderly couples on date nights filled the tables. James Hartley, invited as a guest of honor, found himself approached by a young man in his early 20s. The young man introduced himself as the son of one of the patrons who had been present on the night of the confrontation. "Mr. Hartley," the young man said, his voice filled with emotion. "Bach, I want you to know that what happened here changed my life. I was shipping out for basic training the week after that night. Hearing your story, seeing how you handled yourself, it gave me a new perspective on what it means to serve, not just in the military, but in our community." James, touched by the young man's words, clasped his hand firmly. "That's what it's all about, son," he said. "Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." The impact of the Seasons Bistro incident extended far beyond Millbrook. Other communities, inspired by the story, began to examine their own practices and biases. The state legislature even took notice, introducing a bill to strengthen anti-discrimination laws for public accommodations. Sarah Donovan found her law practice inundated with cases related to discrimination and civil rights. She hired 2 new associates to help handle the workload and began offering pro bono services to individuals who had experienced similar situations to James. For James himself, life changed in ways he never expected. He became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at schools, community centers, and even corporate events. His message of resilience, dignity, and the ongoing fight for equality resonated with audiences across the state. 1 year to the day after the incident, Seasons Bistro hosted a special anniversary event. The restaurant was packed, with a line stretching down the block. James and Sarah were there, along with Mr. Thompson, Amanda, and many of the patrons who had witnessed the original confrontation. As James stood to address the crowd, he looked around the room, taking in the diverse faces looking back at him. There were people of all ages, races, and backgrounds, united in their commitment to creating a more inclusive community. "A year ago," James began, his voice strong and clear, "I walked into this restaurant looking for a meal. What I found instead was a challenge. But more importantly, I found a community willing to rise to that challenge." He paused, his eyes meeting those of Mr. Thompson and Amanda. "We've all come a long way since that night. We've had to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. We've had to learn and grow and change, but look at where we are now." James gestured around the room. "This isn't just a restaurant anymore. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we stand up for what's right, when we refuse to accept discrimination and prejudice as the norm. When we come together, not in spite of our differences, but because of them. As James concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. There were tears in many eyes, and a palpable sense of pride and unity filled the air. Outside Seasons Bistro, the warm glow of the restaurant's lights spilled onto the sidewalk. The sign in the window, "All are welcome here, no exceptions," shone brightly, a beacon of hope and a reminder of the power of one person's stand against injustice. The story of James Hartley and Seasons Bistro had become more than just a local legend. It had become a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the capacity for positive change. In a world often divided by differences, it stood as a shining example of what could be accomplished when a community came together, faced its flaws, and committed to becoming better. As the celebration continued late into the night, the legacy of that fateful evening lived on, not just in Millbrook, but in the hearts and minds of all those who heard the story and were inspired to stand up for equality and justice in their own lives.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.